Okay, good morning. I would like to briefly conclude our study of the Gaussian free field. So I remind you that last week we proved the following. So under the Gibbs measure boundary condition eta, the finite box lambda, and with the non-zero mass n, the spins, I don't remember how I wrote the name like that, the collection of spins followed a Gaussian, so it was a Gaussian vector. It's a Gaussian with mean, let me write it like that, phi I eta lambda m, which was given by the expected value for the symmetric simple random walk on ZD, starting at I, to so the expected value of the boundary condition evaluated at the first point at which the random walk exits the set lambda. It was tau lambda c complement. It was z because it's the massive model that we are considering now. Okay. So that's this skilled random walk that we introduced last week. And then the covariance matrix was given by, say, the covariance between, so in lambda, eta, m, between phi I and phi j, was given by this matrix gm lambda ij, which was just 1 plus m square to the power minus 1. Then the expected value starting at the vertex I for the killed random walk of the total number of the expected number of times the random walk visits the vertex j. So it was n equals 0 to tau lambda c minus 1, indicator that Zn is equal to j. So we derived these formulas for the mean and covariance matrix of this Gaussian field. And now I would just like to point out some consequences that show how different the behavior is from what we saw in the massless case. So the first thing is, so in the massless case, the variance of the field was diverging with lambda, as lambda was increasing towards ZD in dimension 1 and 2. I just want to show that this is not the case anymore. So if I take the supremum over all finite subset of ZD, of say, okay, I can take as well phi 0 here, doesn't matter. And so that's just the supremum. Okay, let's do it like that. Supremum over all lambda in ZD of this quantity. Sorry, this, where am I? I don't want the mean, I want the covariance. I'm a bit. Okay, I want the variance of the field. So it's variance lambda m eta of phi 0. Okay, I want to show that this variance does not blow up. So it's this formula that I want to use. So that's the supremum of gm lambda of 0, 0. I want to show that this is finite uniformly in lambda. Whatever set lambda you take, so in particular if you take an increasing sequence of sets lambda that goes to ZD, this stays bounded in every dimension. And this can be seen immediately from the definition, because this is just the supremum over lambda in ZD. And let me rewrite this as follows. So that's the sum over all n greater or equal 0, probability starting at 0, that at time n the random walk is again at 0, and it has not yet exited the box lambda. Okay, it's just the same thing. I'll just put an indicator instead of this bound here, an indicator here, and then I take the sum out. So that's what you get. And the observation is just that this probability, so we already made this observation last week, so this probability, it's certainly smaller then the probability that the random walk has survived up to time n, which was this first time you enter into the graveyard, so the time at which the random walk is dying. So that certainly, it has to be still alive at time n if it's at vertex 0 at time n, so we certainly have this bound. And this we saw last week that this is given by 1 plus m squared to the power minus n. So now this is obviously summable, and the bound we get is independent of the value of I mean, as long as m is strictly positive, it's independent of lambda. Okay? I think I forgot this 1 plus m squared, but of course does not change anything. Okay? 1 plus m squared minus 1. Okay. Okay, so this is finite uniformly in lambda. So in particular, the variance does not diverge anymore, contrary to what we saw in the massless case. So in any dimension, greater or equal to 1, you get this result. So that was the first thing I wanted to show. And then a second kind of pathology that we noticed in the massless case was the fact that even in dimension 3 and higher, where the field did exist, I mean the thermodynamic of the field was well defined, you had infinite volume Gibbs states. These infinite volume Gibbs states had this very slow decay of correlation that resulted in an infinite susceptibility. So I just want to show that this does not occur here for basically the same reason as we have just seen. So let's just look at the limit as lambda increases to ZD of the covariance between, say, phi 0 and phi I. So again, take this formula, and again, by monotone convergence, the same argument we made in the massless case, when lambda is going to ZD, what happens is that this tau lambda c is going to I mean, the probability of exiting the box is going to infinity. So this gives you, in the limit, 1 plus m squared minus 1, sum over all n greater or equal 0, probability starting at 0 that Zn is equal to I. So it's not dead at time n, it's at vertex I. And there is no more, there is nothing about exiting the box lambda because I've taken the limit, right? And I use this monotone convergence to do that. Okay, so we get an expression of this type. And now I just want to do this, so it's very similar to what we did here. I just want to be a bit more careful by not just bounding this in this way. So if this occurs, if you remember we saw last week that this probability can always be decomposed into two parts. So first is that my random walk survives, so tau star is larger than n. And then we have a second term, which is the probability that the usual simple random walk at time n is at I. So we had an identity like that between the process Zn and process Xn, relating these two processes that we saw last week. Okay. So that's a refinement of what we used here, because I'm still keeping track of this probability here. And I will only use it in a very weak way. So the only thing I want to observe is that this probability of being at I at time n, it will be equal to 0 if n is not at least, okay, this is equal to 0 if n is smaller than the distance between 0 and I, because I simply don't have enough time to go from 0 to I in a smaller, I mean, if n is smaller than that, there are no passes of such length going from 0 to I. Okay, so this means that this expression is actually smaller than 1 plus m squared minus 1, sum over all n greater or equal to 0, greater or equal to I1 of E minus, so again, this is 1 plus m squared, I write it like that, 1 plus m squared minus n, this expression here. So you see now that you get again something that is convergent, but it's not only convergent, it's actually smaller than a constant which depends on n times I1. Okay, C of m is strictly positive. So, so what you see is that this covariance, which was decaying very slowly in the massless case, is now decaying exponentially fast with the distance. So it's exponentially fast with the distance between the two spins. Okay? So introducing this mass regularizes dramatically the behavior of the field. It makes the field well-defined thermodynamic limit in any dimension, and moreover, the correlation, the covariances in the field decay exponentially fast now. Okay, so that's the main thing I wanted to say. I've only discussed the covariance structure because that's the interesting part. We can repeat exactly what we said in the massless case for the mean of the field. So we saw in the massless case that if I was taking as boundary condition any harmonic function, eta, then this, in the thermodynamic limit, led to a field which had this harmonic function as a mean. And we can do exactly the same thing here. Now, what you have to take is one of these n harmonic functions, so solution of minus Laplacian plus m squared equals 0. And you can then repeat exactly the same argument. In particular, you still have an infinite number of infinite volume Gibbs states in this model, so in any dimension, greater or equal 1, infinitely many Gibbs states. They all have the same covariance structure because the covariance structure does not depend on the boundary condition, exactly as in the massless case, but they have different means, and you can get infinitely many of them by using infinitely many different m harmonic functions as boundary conditions, exactly as before. And the way you construct all these m harmonic functions is exactly the same way you construct them in the massless case. You just fix arbitrary real values along two successive rows of Z2, say, if you're in 2 dimensions, and then you complete using the harmonicity, you complete this to an harmonic function on the whole plane. It's exactly the same thing that we did in the massless case. So, so what you see in this model is that there are no regime in which you have a unique infinite volume Gibbs state, in contrast to what we saw in the Ising model, where at high temperature you had always uniqueness of the Gibbs state. Here it never happens. Okay, you always have infinitely many, uncountably many infinite volume Gibbs states. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about the GFF. There are, of course, infinitely many more things that we can say about this model, but I don't want to spend more time on it. Instead, I would like to start discussing models which are of more direct, which have more direct link to what we saw in the chapter on the Ising model, which are models that I will call models with continuous symmetry. Continuous symmetry. So these will be models which will be very similar to the Ising model, superficially at least very similar to the Ising model. And but they will differ from it in the fact that the symmetry that the Hamiltonian enjoy. So in the Ising model, when the magnetic field was equal to 0, we saw that the Hamiltonian was invariant under interchange of pluses and minus spins. Okay. And so it's a discrete symmetry. It's essentially, it's just a spin flip symmetry. And here we are going to consider model which have as a symmetry group, a Lie group. So it's a continuous symmetry group acting on our configurations. And we will see that this completely changes the behavior of the system in low dimensions. So that's what I want to explain. So let's start with one class of such models, which is the class I will discuss, which I will call ON symmetric model. So in these models, the spins will take value in the n-dimensional sphere. So let's fix n, at least one, an integer. Then let me denote by S n minus 1, say Rn, the n-dimensional sphere. So Sn minus 1 is just the set of all x in Rn with x2 equal 1, so the unit sphere. Then our configurations will be given by, I will associate to every vertex of the lattice ZD a spin taking value in this unit sphere. So this will just be S n minus 1 ZD, or ZD. So it's completely similar to what we had in the Ising model, but instead of having only two possible directions for your arrows, now you have, in general, when n is at least 2, you have an infinite number of directions. So that's a picture for n equal to 2, where they take value in the circle. You get a configuration which looks something like that. Okay. So these are the configurations. Now I will introduce, as usual, the random variable that gives you the spin at a particular vertex. So the spin at I in ZD, spin at I, it will be denoted in this chapter SI. Again, I'm sorry that the notation for the spins changes in each chapter, but I'm using the usual notations, conventional notation, so that's the usual choice. So SI of omega is just omega I, okay, where omega is an element of this configuration space, just the spin at the vertex I. So this describes the configurations of the model. So the next step, as usual, as we have already done in the two previous chapters, is to describe the Hamiltonian that will give you the energy associated to such a configuration finite set lambda. And then we'll be able to define the finite volume Gibbs distribution. So let me do it here. So the Hamiltonian in lambda, a finite subset of ZD, will be denoted H lambda beta. And let me write it directly in terms of the spins. So this will be defined as beta sum over all edges intersecting the box lambda of some function W of Si scalar product Sj. So that's just the scalar product in Rn. Okay, these are two vectors in Rn. I can identify them two vectors in Rn. That's just the scalar product. Okay. And W is some function. At the moment, I'm not saying anything special. Say from -1, 1 to R. Okay. Actually, in this chapter, I will always assume that W is somehow smooth. I will assume that it's twice continuously differentiable. Okay, let me assume it now. But it's not. It's technically convenient. Everything I'm going to say can be done for, say, certainly for any continuous W, okay, but the proofs become much more involved. So I will always assume that it's twice continuously differentiable. Continuously. For simplicity. Okay, so that's the Hamiltonian. Let me give you a few examples. And for all these examples, which are known as the ON models, the function W takes a particularly simple form. You just have W of x, which is equal to -x. So the Hamiltonian is just minus beta sum over edges intersecting the box lambda of Si scalar product Sj. Okay, so that looks very similar to the Hamiltonian of the Ising model. It's exactly the same. You would have sigma I, sigma j. And actually, if you take n equal to 1, then you have the unit sphere in R. The unit sphere in R is just 2 points. Right? It's +1, -1. So you have two vectors that you can identify with plus and minus of the Ising model. So when n equal 1, you just recover exactly the Ising model. So this model, when n is equal to 1, is the Ising model. when n is equal to 2, it's known as the XY model. And when n is equal to 3, it's known as the Heisenberg model. So it's classical XY and classical Heisenberg model, because there exists a quantum version of them, Heisenberg. Voilà. So these are the three most famous models in this class, but of course this model makes sense for arbitrary, and this model makes sense for arbitrary values of n. Okay. And the whole discussion in this chapter, it will be centered on the fact that there is a huge difference between n equal 1 and n greater or equal to 2. And this difference comes from the following. If you look at the Hamiltonian here, you see that this scalar product that appears in this function w here, it's of course, the scalar product does not change if Si and Sj are both rotated by the same angle. If I apply the same rotation on Si and Sj, the scalar product is left unchanged. It's an invariant under the group of rotations. So this is invariant under rotation, under rotation, say simultaneous rotation of Si and Sj by the same amount, or by identical rotations. Rotation of Si and Sj. But now if I take all the spins in my lattice and I all rotate them by the same angle, and I apply the same rotation, all the spins on my lattice, then the whole Hamiltonian is invariant. Because each term in the sum is invariant, so the whole Hamiltonian will be invariant if I rotate everybody on my lattice by some angle. Okay? So that means that the Hamiltonian is invariant under this group of rotation. And this group of rotation, okay, it's a discrete group when n equal to 1, because when n equals 1, it's just the reflection through 0. It's just you reflect r to minus r. Okay. But in dimension, when n equal to 2 or more, it's really it's a Lie group, so it's a continuous symmetry. So in this case, you have a continuous symmetry group, a Lie group, a continuous symmetry. But in this case, you have a discrete symmetry. Okay. And we'll see that the fact that the symmetry group is continuous completely changes the physics of the system, at least in low dimensions. Okay, this is what I will explain in this chapter. Okay. So that's for the Hamiltonian. So once you have defined the Hamiltonian, of course, you can define the Gibbs measure. So the Gibbs measure in lambda. That's enough. Seems a bit. Wait. Should be fine. So the Gibbs measure in lambda at inverse temperature beta will be given by the following probability measure on omega. Okay. As usual, so it will be given, be denoted mu and boundary condition eta. Boundary condition eta. So it will be mu eta lambda beta, always the same type of notation. Probability that it gives to a particular event A will be given by some normalization that I will write as usual. And then we have the integral over A of exponential of minus the Hamiltonian in lambda. And I will use the same notation that we used in the GFF, that is the configuration. I will write it as omega inside lambda and the boundary condition outside lambda. Again, it's convenient because it allows me to write the the measure on which I'm integrating as just the product over I in lambda d omega I. Where this d omega I, again, they are Lebesgue measure on the n-dimensional sphere. If you want the Haar measure on the sphere, the uniform measure on the sphere, uniform measure on Sn minus 1. Okay. Okay, so this defines the Gibbs measure associated to these models. Of course, the partition function is as usual. But, let me write it again. It's not long. It's just the integral of E minus H lambda beta omega lambda eta lambda C product over I in lambda d omega I. Good. So that's the definition. Now let me state the main result of the chapter. Actually, there will be two, but let me state the first one. And for this, I need a bit of notation. So line 2, absence of continuous symmetry breaking in low dimension. So let's denote by capital R an orthogonal matrix, so a rotation in Rn. Okay. And I would like to let this rotation act on all the configurations, so on all the spins of a configuration. So I will denote by small r the function acting on configurations in omega, which associate to a configuration omega, the configuration r omega, which is just the configuration that you obtain by acting with r, the same rotation r on all the spins of the configuration. Okay. You just rotate you apply the same rotation to all spins of the configuration. You can denote this small r. So it's a simultaneous rotation of all spins. And I don't, okay, to say that, I will just use the okay, it's an abuse of notation, but I will say that R is in SO. If I write that, I really mean that it's the extension to configuration of the usual rotation in Rn. Okay, so now I can state this first theorem, which is known as the Mermin-Wagner theorem. Mermin and Wagner were they proved the first version of this theorem. It was much weaker than the version I will state, but it was already in the same spirit. They introduced the same type of ideas I'm going to use. So theorem 9.2, Mermin-Wagner. Theorem. So what I'm going to assume is that n is greater or equal to 2. So the fact that the symmetry group is continuous and not discrete is absolutely essential in the proof. As I said, I will assume that this function w is twice continuously differentiable. That's not necessary, it's just convenient. N greater or equal to 2 is necessary. This is just for convenience, technical convenience. Then, when D is equal to 1 or 2, we have the following. All infinite volume Gibbs states associated to such a model. Again, the spins are bounded now. So by compactness, you can construct infinite volume Gibbs state. There are no issues about existence of infinite volume Gibbs states in such models. So all infinite volume Gibbs states are SON invariant. By what I mean the following. So for any beta, if I take a local function, so it will be for any f local, if I take a local function f, and I take an infinite volume Gibbs state, which I denote like that, I compute the expected value of f, the average of f under this infinite volume Gibbs state, and I compare it with the average value of f after I've applied a rotation by an angle psi. So let me write it like that, because I will need it later. Okay, let me do it like that for a moment. So some arbitrary rotation, I will say in a second. So I want these two quantities. I want to look at these two quantities, and I claim that these two quantities are equal for any R in SON in the sense that I've just mentioned here. So you take an arbitrary rotation of Rn that acts simultaneously on all the spins of the configuration. So you take all the spins, you rotate them, then you compute f. Or you just compute f without doing the rotation, you get exactly the same average in both cases. So I will explain what this means, because maybe it's not completely clear what this tells you. But it tells you something very strong about the model. It's there. Now, before turning to the proof of this thing, I want to make some remarks to give you some understanding of what the claim is actually saying. So remarks. So first remark is that the theorem, I don't know what was the number, 9.2, implies the following. If you take an arbitrary subset of Sn minus 1 of the sphere, say, of course, when I'm discussing this kind of thing, I'm always assuming that the sets are all measurable and so on. So I've not said it here either. So I'm always assuming measurability, otherwise it makes no sense. Okay? So for any measurable subset of the sphere, for any vertex of the lattice, and for any infinite volume Gibbs state, we have the following. So I'm just applying the theorem there. So I'm looking at particular function, which is the indicator of A. So I'm looking at, if you want, the probability that the spin at I, the value that the spin at I takes, falls inside this particular subset of the unit sphere. Then by applying this theorem, this is just the same thing as 1A of Si composed with particular rotation, any rotation. Okay, I could add here R in S1. But this is, of course, the same as the expected value of the indicator of R minus 1A of Si. This is clear because when I make a change of variable to go from Si composed with the rotation to Si, this part, this d omega I here is the uniform measure on the sphere, so it's invariant in the rotations. So when you make the change of variable, you are just transforming the event in the opposite direction. So you're applying the other rotation to the set A. So you have this identity, which is true for any event A. So from this, it's very easy, from this identity. So this you can interpret as the probability that the spin at I, so if n was equal to 2, so they take value in the disk, what I'm really doing is this. I'm taking some small set A. So this is A, subset of the unit disk, and I'm looking at the probability that Si takes value inside this set A. It's pointing in the direction of this set A. And what I'm saying is that if instead of taking this set A, I take a rotated version of it, I'm putting it here. So that's R minus 1A. Then the probability that Si points inside this set is exactly the same. Okay? So from this point of view, it's pretty clear that this will imply, just a tiny bit of work, that this implies that Si is uniformly distributed. Over the sphere. Okay. Same probability for any rotated set, so just get the uniform distribution over the unit sphere. So in particular, if you take the expected value of Si, look at the expected value of Si under your infinite volume Gibbs state, which is any infinite volume Gibbs state, any state that you can construct in infinite volume, this will always be equal to 0 by symmetry. Okay. It must be invariant under rotation, so the only possible value is 0. Okay. So there is no spontaneous magnetization in this model. When d is equal to 1 or 2. Okay. So when d equal 1, it's not very surprising because already in the Ising model we saw that in dimension 1 there is no spontaneous magnetization at any temperature. But here it's also true in dimension 2. So second remark is that this is false when n is equal to 1. We have seen that the 2D Ising model satisfies expected value of sigma 0 plus. Let me put beta, 0 for no field. Okay. This is strictly positive when beta is larger than beta c of 2. Okay. So there is really a difference between n equal 1 and larger values of n. Okay. Changes dramatically. I have some other comments, I think. Not sure I want to. Okay, let me briefly mention this. So it will follow not, I mean, it does not follow immediately from the statement as I've written it here, but it will follow from the proof of this statement because the way I'm going to prove this theorem is by proving a much more quantitative version of it. So it will follow from the proof. Follows from the proof that if you look at the scalar product between S0 and Si, and you let I go to infinity, then this will go to 0. Okay. So this implies that there is no I let some place long-range order in this model. So I talked about long-range order when discussing the Ising model. If you look at the same quantity in the Ising model, if you look at the expected value of sigma 0, sigma I, when beta is larger than beta c and dimension is 2 or higher, this does not go to 0. Okay, we saw that in the chapter on the Ising model. So there was long-range order in the Ising model. Here it's not the case. So again, dimension 1 and 2. Okay. One has to be a bit careful here. I've left some space because I have to be specific about what kind of long-range order. So what cannot happen is that you have a long-range order for the direction that the spins take. Okay? This is not possible. You cannot have at large distance a memory of the direction at which S0 is pointing. This will never affect the value of Si when it's sufficiently far away. Okay? That's what you cannot have. But it's possible that you have some other long-range order which is hidden and of a more subtle kind than what you see here. So one way to say that is that the theorem does not imply, in the sense that there are counterexamples, does not imply uniqueness of the Gibbs state. I don't want to give an example here, but you can construct models in which you have a continuous symmetry group. Of course, the continuous part of the symmetry, but it's a continuous symmetry group that is typically not connected. And the continuous part cannot be broken, so this theorem, of course, applies. So the Gibbs measure will be invariant under the action of this continuous symmetry group, but there is a discrete subgroup of this group that can be broken, and this can give rise to some form of long-range order, but it cannot be of orientational type. So it cannot be that the spins point in a given direction in average. Okay, so that I wanted to say. And maybe I just say it orally. This is just as an illustration of this phenomenology that I want to describe in this chapter, but everything I'm saying here, in particular the fact that I'm only looking at models which are invariant under rotation, this is not a real restriction. Actually, we can prove exactly the same kind of theorem. We can essentially deduce it from the theorem I'm going to prove. The fact that if your Hamiltonian is invariant under the action of any compact connected Lie group, then all the infinite volume Gibbs states are also invariant under the action of this compact connected Lie group. It's not just for SON, it's for any compact connected Lie group. Okay, so it's a much more general claim than what I'm stating, but this will be enough to understand the ideas. And now I want to turn to the proof of this theorem, and before proving the theorem, I want to give you some insight as to what distinguishes n equal to 1 from n equal 2, for example. How the fact that you go from a discrete to a continuous symmetry can impact the behavior of such systems. So I want to spend 10 minutes explaining this. And the argument I'm going to make, which will be heuristic, will not be a proof, just a heuristic argument, will actually be very close to what we'll use in the actual proof of theorem 992. Okay, so I think we make the break now, and we start again in 15 minutes. Okay, so we'll start. So here is what I wanted to explain. So heuristic argument. And I want to explain the difference between n equal 1 and n equal 2. So I only consider these two cases. And the point will be the following. So I'm going to take one of these square boxes we use usually, say Bn, the square box with radius n, and I'm going to put all arrows pointing upward outside the box. So the boundary condition will be pure upward. Okay, and so on. Everywhere you put up arrows. And then I'm interested in how much energy I need to reverse the arrow in the middle of the box. Okay, so I'm looking at the minimal energy configuration. Minimal energy configuration such that, say, S0 points downward. Okay, we do it like that. Okay, given that the boundary condition points upward. Now, when n is equal to 1, it's just the Ising model. So when n is equal to 1, you have your box here, you have plus boundary condition, and you want a minus spin in the middle. Then we know very well what is the least expensive way of doing that from an energetic point of view. Well, you have to put some contour surrounding the minus spin because of the boundary condition, which are plus. That's what we use in the Peierls argument. And the smallest possible contour is the contour of size 4, which is just here. Okay, that's the, and then you put pluses everywhere outside. So you have pluses everywhere. And just one minus in the middle of the box. And this, the energy cost that you have to pay for that will be 2 beta for each of these edges, so it will be in general, say, 4d beta, if you are in dimension d. So in any dimension for the Ising model, you have that the cost that you have to pay is strictly positive. So that's what I'm interested in, is the fact that you pay something to reverse the spin in the middle, something which is uniform, strictly positive, uniformly in the size of the box Bn. Okay. It's because you pay something that you have some hope of being able to make a Peierls argument, which is what we did in the Ising model. Right? Of course, it's not a sufficient condition. We saw that in dimension 1 for the Ising model, you still have this. You still have some cost associated to flipping the spin in the middle of the box, but this cost is not enough to implement a Peierls argument, and it fails. But certainly it's a necessary condition. You need to have something like that if you want to implement a Peierls type argument. Now what we are going to see is that this does not happen when n is equal to 2, and dimension is 1 or 2. So let's now look at n equal 2. So the XY model, let's say. Then it's very convenient, or more general, it's not only the XY. The XY model is one example of model with n equal to 2. Okay? And what I want to do, since n is equal to 2, the spins are taking value in the circle, it's very convenient in order to draw things, to write down expressions, to parameterize the vectors on the unit circles by their angle. So I want this to be cos theta I sine theta I with, say, theta I, which belongs to minus pi. Here it's open. Okay, just to be specific. So it's the same, for n equal to 2, it's the same. Specifying points on R2 which have norm 1 and just corresponding angles, so I will play with the angles. And now the point is that when n is equal to 2, you can try to do better. I mean, of course, you could still try to do the same thing that we did for the Ising model and put everybody up inside the box, except for the guy which is in the middle. This would still give you a cost of this type, but that's not the best you can do. What you can try to do is to use the fact that indeed the spins take continuous values, so maybe I can improve considerably on the minimal energy by doing something like that. So let me just draw one line because it will be too complicated to draw otherwise, but maybe I can do some slow rotation from the middle of the box to the boundary of the box, and if the box is big enough, my rotation will be so slow that maybe it will not cost me too much. Okay? So you have a nicer picture in the book. I'm not able to do it on the board, but That's what we want to do. So I'm going to give you one such configuration. It's not the optimal one, but it's close enough to the optimal one that we will be able to deduce what we want. And this configuration, I denote it, so where is it? Here, I will denote it omega SW for spin wave. We'll see later, which is just a collection of cos theta I spin wave sine theta I spin wave in ZD. Okay, it's a collection like that. And let me tell you what this is, what these angles are. So theta I spin wave will be chosen as 0 if I is not in the box Bn. So outside the box, I don't do. Okay, I've not said. So my angle, I set the angle theta. If I want that to correspond to the picture, I will measure the angle theta with respect to the vertical direction. So that's the angle theta here. Okay. So theta equals 0 corresponds to this boundary condition here. So that's theta equals 0. Okay. So I want 0 boundary condition outside. So I will take a configuration which is 0 outside. And then inside, I will choose the following quantity. It will be pi times 1 minus the log of 1 plus the infinity norm of I over log of 1 plus n. Okay, that's if I is in Bn. Okay. So it's some function which of course, when I is equal to 0, you just get pi, which is, so you indeed have a spin pointing downward in the middle of the box, and then you have some interpolation between 0 and pi, which is given by this particular expression. If you want, I can again draw a picture from a slice of this. So that's the boundary of the box Bn. That's 0. Then at 0, we have a value which is pi. Outside, we have 0. And the function has a logarithmic profile, something like that. So if I see this function from the side, I see something like that. Okay, that's okay. Good. So now let me show you that this is a good idea. So where is it? So let's compute the difference between the energy in Bn. Let me omit beta, okay, from the notation. The energy of this spin wave configuration, omega spin wave, minus the energy of the configuration which is compatible with the boundary condition everywhere, which I will just denote omega upward. So that's configuration which has upper rows everywhere, so it's theta equals 0 everywhere, and that's this special theta spin wave that I've shown there. So that's how much I have to pay. I already have to pay something because this is not 0, and then that's how much more I have to pay if I want to flick the spin in the middle. Okay, so I want to control this quantity. So what can I say about this quantity? So let's look at it slowly. So the way I chose my theta I has the following properties. So theta I was chosen to be constant on squares. So on each of these layers, okay, I will not draw them all. On each layer, theta I spin wave is constant. So theta spin wave constant on each layer. Okay, it's obvious because it depends on the L infinity norm of I, so on the value of the largest component of I. So it will be constant on these sets. Okay. And that means that if I'm looking at theta I spin wave minus theta j spin wave for ij to neighbors. Okay. I only get a non-zero contribution if one of the two, say I, is on one layer, that would be I, and j is its neighbors on the next layer, that would be j. Okay. Because then the values are different. Okay? If I take I and j on the same layer, I get 0 as a difference. So this is different from 0 only if I infinity is equal to j infinity minus 1. Okay. So when this happens, so when this is the case, so let's take I neighboring j, I infinity equals j infinity minus 1. And let's compute what theta I minus theta j is. So theta I spin wave minus theta j spin wave. Well, the expression is there. So you get, I'm interested in spins which are inside the box. Outside is 0 everywhere, so it's not very interesting. So it's pi. Okay. Then when I make I take the difference, the 1 just disappears. It's the same for both. So I get pi over log 1 plus n. Which multiplies log, okay, actually I don't need parentheses, so it will be log of 1 plus j infinity over 1 plus I infinity. Okay? Now, 1 plus I infinity in the denominator, this is just j infinity. Okay, by assumption. So that's pi over log 1 plus n, which multiplies log of 1 plus 1 over j infinity. Okay. Now using the usual inequality from Jensen, but it's trivial inequality, that's smaller than log 1 plus n, and log of 1 plus x is smaller than x, so I get 1 over j infinity. Okay, so it's just an upper bound on this difference. Okay. Good. So now, with that, I can easily bound this difference of energies. So I have this difference of theta. So if you remember in the Hamiltonian was a function, so the Hamiltonian was of the form beta, sum over all ij in E lambda b. And then you had this W of Si times Sj, okay, which is, of course, that's just W of cosine theta I minus theta j, theta I minus theta j, okay. And this W of cosine, I want to give it a name, I will call it V. So this is just V of theta I minus theta j. Okay. So V of x is W of cosine of x. Okay. Just to have lighter notations, then I can look at what this V of theta I minus theta j is. So let's see what this is. So this I'm going to Taylor expand around 0. So this will be V of 0. V prime of 0, theta I minus theta j, plus 1/2, V second of something, alpha ij, some number, theta I minus theta j square. Okay, that's just an identity. I'm stopping my Taylor series at the second order term, and I get some number that I won't care about in the sequel. And now let's make some observation about this. So the first one is that V prime of 0 if you look at definition of v, it's w of cosine of x. So it will be w prime of cosine of 0, which is w prime of 1, times minus sine of 0, but that's 0. So 0. So this guy is not there. It's just equal to 0. Now, for the second order term, what I can use is the fact that I've assumed w is C2. It's twice continuously differentiable, so it's also the case for v, because it's the composition of cosine and w, which are both C2 functions. So it's certainly a C2 function. Okay. So if it's C2, its second derivative is continuous. Okay. And that means that v second is continuous. It's a continuous function on a compact set, which is just the circle, so it's bounded. V second will be smaller than a constant c. Okay, so this is just bounded. It's bounded by a constant c. Okay, so in the end, we get that this v theta I minus theta j is v0 is smaller than v of 0 plus 1/2 c theta I minus theta j square. And now I inject this inside this difference. So I get that the energy in Bn of this omega spin wave minus the energy in Bn of omega up. This will be equal to the sum overall Ij in EBn. B, it's a bit too low. And then I get the difference of the v's. So I will get what I've, okay, it will be smaller than v of 0 plus c over 2 theta I minus theta j square. That's what we got from this expression here, minus, and the corresponding quantity for this guy, but then for this guy, all the spins point in the same direction. So the angle difference will always be 0. So it will be minus v of 0. Okay. Okay, it's theta spin wave everywhere. Okay, so the v of 0 disappears, and the only thing you're left with is this c over 2 theta I spin wave minus theta j spin wave square, and the sum over ij as above. To find a better choke, it's becoming impossible. Okay. So now I can use the fact that theta I minus theta j is bounded by this, and I have the conclusion I want. So this is smaller than, so the c over 2 is there. Then I get pi square over log 1 plus n square. So pi square log 1 plus n square. Okay. And then I get the sum over all differences of angles, which I can, what I can do is I can sum over r, which is the value of j infinity. So it goes from 1 to n plus 1. I get 1 over r square. That's 1 over j infinity square. And then I have the number of, do I still have a picture? Yeah. I have the number of pairs of neighbors like that I have to take into account. This you can check, it's equal, but actually you don't care about the constant. It's given by 8r in dimension 2. It's some constant. Okay, let me do it in any case dimension 2. So it's 8r. So this is bounded by some constant. I take all these numbers which play no role. I call them c tilde. I get log 1 plus n square, sum r from 1 to n plus 1 of 1 over r. But this gives me again, so this is certainly smaller than twice log of n plus 1. Okay. it's much better than that. It's bounded by log n plus 1 plus 1. But okay, it's certainly smaller than twice log n plus 1. So one of these log n plus 1 disappears. So what I get is this is smaller than c hat, c tilde tilde, divided by log 1 plus n. Okay? And you see that this goes to 0 as n goes to infinity. It goes very slowly to 0. It goes to 0 as 1 over log n, but it goes to 0 as n goes to infinity. That means that when you have this continuous symmetry, so if you look at this model with n equal to 2, you can use the fact that you have these continuous spins in order to reduce the energetic cost it takes to flip the spin in the middle of the box to 0, asymptotically. Okay? It does not cost anything to flip the spin in the middle of the box. If I take a box which is large enough, it does not cost anything in the limit. Okay? So of course, under such conditions, it's pretty clear that it will be very difficult to maintain the long-range order. You have chosen your boundary condition pointing upward. It does not cost anything to flip the spin in the middle. So of course, that does not cost anything to flip any spin. And you get a complete mess in your box, at least on large distances. Okay? So that's the big difference. There is no hope to implement a Peierls type argument in such a setting. Okay? So it's not a surprise that we will be able to show that indeed there is no orientational long-range order in such models. There is no spontaneous magnetization in such models. You cannot maintain the effect of boundary condition far away from the boundary. Okay. So that was the heuristics. Of course, it's a very non-rigorous argument. It's not clear what it really tells you. Okay. But it turns out that the actual proof that you are going to start now is very much along these lines. Okay. It's very similar to this argument. That's why one of the reasons I wanted to state it is that it will maybe make it easier to understand what is actually going on in this more complicated proof that we are going to do now. So how can we make this rigorous? It's B. Okay. B. Proof of Mermin-Wagner theorem. And actually, I'm not going to prove the theorem as I stated it. I'm going to prove something more quantitative. So we are going to prove actually going to prove the stronger claim, the stronger proposition 9.7. So for this proof, I assume that D is equal to 1 or 2, and I assume that N is equal to 2. For simplicity, actually, the case of general N can be reduced to N equal to 2. Maybe you will do it in exercise, we'll see. So assume that W is C2, as I said. Then there exists constant C1, C2, such that for any local function, any boundary condition, any beta, and any angle psi, the following is true. So we have that the expected value of f in the box Bn with boundary condition eta. I compare it with the expected value of f composed with a rotation of angle psi. Okay. N equal to 2, so the rotation are just specified by an angle in the same box with the same boundary condition. So I'm looking at this difference. So that in finite volume and for arbitrary boundary condition, if I get a uniform estimate now, if I'm stating something which is uniform, then we'll be able to take thermodynamic limit and to deduce the corresponding claim for the infinite volume Gibbs states. Okay, just as a corollary. So this is indeed uniformly bounded. It's bounded by beta to the 1/2 absolute value of psi, infinite sup norm of f, and then the interesting part, which is C1 over root n in dimension 1, and it's C2 square root of L. I will say what L is in a second. C2 square root of L over square root of log n in dimension 2. So let me just say what L is. You see, nothing depends on the boundary condition eta in the right-hand side. Okay, so where L, so R psi is rotation by psi. Okay, and of all spins, okay, the usual rotation acting on configuration. And L, so that's R, and L is such that it's an integer such that the support of the function f is included inside BL. Okay, so the picture would be, so that's the end of the statement, and then I make maybe a picture of the setting. So we have the box Bn, that's Bn. Outside Bn, we have some boundary condition eta, which is anything, doesn't matter. Then I have some small fixed box BL. L is fixed, does not change. N you can take to infinity, but L should be thought of as being fixed. And the support of F is some subset of BL. I want to guarantee that the support of F is far away from the boundary. I need, in some sense, to have this fixed, so that's one way of doing it. Okay? Then you get the bounds which are stated there. Okay. So clearly, from these bounds, if you let n go to infinity, this goes to 0, and then you conclude that you get the same expectation for f and for f composed with the rotation in any infinite volume Gibbs state. Okay. So that indeed implies the Merlin-Wagner theorem. But it's much stronger because it gives you quantitative rate of decay and the finite volume analog of the Merlin-Wagner theorem. Okay, this is not important, so let's start with the proof. So proof of this proposition 9.7. So to make the notation a bit lighter, I will use lambda for Bn. I will denote lambda instead of Bn. It's a bit shorter. I assume, of course, that n is larger than L. Otherwise, my statement is not very interesting. And then let's go. Let's see what we can say. So we are interested in something which is this expectation, eta. Lambda, again, I will not denote beta. It's fixed in the proof, so it's not necessary to write it down. And then I get z lambda eta minus 1, partition function. And then I get the integral of f of r psi of omega. That's just the definition of the function I'm interested in. Then I get the Boltzmann weight, E minus h lambda omega lambda eta lambda complement. Okay. And then I have just the product over I in lambda, d omega I. Right, that's just the definition of the expected value that I'm interested in. Now, what I want to do is to do something similar to what we did in this heuristic argument. So here, so now let me modify this picture. So this function r psi inside this box, so the function f only fills what happens inside this box. So inside this box, I should have this rotation by psi, so let me put psi. So that's the rotation I want inside the box. Okay. Of course, this r psi is acting everywhere. It's rotating everybody everywhere. But since I'm only interested in what it's doing inside the box, because if that's the only spins that the function f cares about, it's the spins that are inside the box BL. So I could just as well replace this rotation that is rotating everybody by psi by rotation that is rotating by psi inside the box BL, by 0 outside the box BL, and some interpolation, the same type of interpolation we had in the heuristic argument in between. So that's what I'm going to introduce now. So I'm going to introduce a function psi from ZD. I don't remember if put R or not yet. A priori, it can be anything, such that I'm going to consider some function like that, which has the property that psi I is equal to 0 if I is not in lambda, and psi I is equal to small psi if I is in BL. Okay. I want psi that has these two properties. Of course, there are many choices at the moment. And at some point in the proof, near the end of the proof, I will take the best possible psi which has these two properties. What it means to be the best possible will be clear later. It's not clear now. But certainly I want these two properties to be satisfied. And then I will choose the best possible one. Now, once I've defined this particular function psi, kind of inhomogeneous rotation, I'm rotating the spins by, I want to rotate the spins by an amount psi, which depends on the vertex. So let me introduce this rotation. I will denote it by T psi. So this is acting on configurations. Okay. And I want that the angle of the configuration that I get once I've transformed it with T psi, so T psi omega, that's theta I of omega. So at vertex I, it's taking the spins that you see there, and it's adding psi I to it. Psi. So I want this for all I. Okay. So I'm rotating the spin at I by an angle that is given by psi I. Okay. So it's an inhomogeneous rotation. That I want to apply. So it might look weird. Why do we want to do that? But it's okay. It's something that you want to try to do something similar to what you did in the heuristic argument. So this looks like something similar to what we did in the heuristic argument. So let's pursue this path and see where it leads us. So some observation about this function, T psi. So T psi acts as the identity outside lambda. Okay, but just because psi is 0 outside lambda, so my rotation is rotation by 0 outside lambda, so it's the identity. And as r psi, or r minus, okay, that will simplify formulas later if I put a -1 here. Put a -1. Otherwise, I will carry minuses all the time in the computation. It's better to do it at the start so that it disappears. R minus psi inside BL. Okay. It's just a pure rotation by angle minus psi inside BL. It's a rotation by 0 outside. And moreover, second observation is that the inverse of this transformation T psi is just T minus psi. Okay. If I want to undo my inhomogeneous rotation, just do the inhomogeneous rotation with the opposite angle. Okay. So these are two very elementary observations. And now I can move on to return to this expression. So I have my expected value of f composed with r psi, which is here, eta lambda. We have seen that this is z lambda eta minus 1 integral of f of r psi omega, and then the e minus h lambda omega lambda eta lambda c, product of the omega. Okay. Just the expression that we had before. Now, remember that the function f only sees what happens inside the box BL. So this is equal to f t minus psi omega. Okay. If I apply t minus psi to the configuration omega, well, inside BL, this just gives me a rotation by plus psi inside BL, which is exactly what I saw before. So since f only sees what happens inside the box BL, doesn't care the fact that these two operations don't act in the same way outside the box BL. It's just the same quantity. Okay, so I do this thing. And then I can now make a change of variables. I want to send, maybe I will put it here. I want to substitute t minus psi omega. I want to send it to omega. I will just make a change of variable in my integral. Okay. This change of variable has a Jacobian equal to 1. So that means that I get the following if I do this change of variable. So this is unchanged, the constant integral. This becomes f of omega because I've applied. I've inverted the transform and made this change of variables. And then I get E minus H lambda. And now I have T psi omega lambda eta lambda complement. Okay, I make the change of variables. So I have the inverse operation acting on the guy here. And the Jacobian is 1, so I still have just the product of the omega. Okay. Not done anything much, just rewritten things in terms of this T psi. And now, I want to interpret this expression as the expected value of f under a new measure. So let me introduce a new measure that I will call the psi-deformed Gibbs measure. It will be denoted by mu lambda eta psi. And the property it gives to an event A is just some normalization. So at the moment, let me write it like that. Z lambda eta psi minus 1. Then I have the integral over A of E minus H lambda T psi omega lambda eta lambda complement product over I d omega I. Okay. So the only difference with respect to the original Gibbs measure is the fact that inside the Hamiltonian, I'm first acting here with this inhomogeneous rotation T psi. Okay? The one that appears in this computation here. Okay. Now, using again the fact that the Jacobian is 1, you can very easily show, I let you do that the partition function is constant. So that's the same, that's equal to Z lambda eta minus 1. The psi does not change anything. You just make this change of variable inside the expression for the partition function here, and you see that you get the original one because the Jacobian of the transformation is 1. Okay. So you get this, so which means that now I'm able to reinterpret this expression in terms of this an expectation under this probability measure. So I get that f composed with r psi in lambda with boundary condition eta is actually equal to the expected value of f in lambda eta psi with this new measure. So what have I gained by doing that? Remember what we are trying to do. So it's not on the board anymore, but what we want to do is to bound the difference between f eta lambda and f composed with r psi eta lambda. We want to bound to show that this is small when the box is large. Okay? But this I can rewrite by this identity as f eta lambda minus the expectation of f under a new measure eta psi lambda. Okay? So I started with something which is nasty, which is how can I compare the expected value of two different local functions, f and f composed with r psi, under the same measure, with a much nicer problem, which is how can I compare the expected value of a given function f under two different probability measures. Why is it better? It's better because there are tools to do that I will explain to you now. Okay. And one of these tools is the relative entropy between measures. So that's what I want to explain. I will do it on another board. So let me make a parenthesis on the relative entropy. Maybe we can also give you some exercises on that. Otherwise, there is a whole appendix on the relative entropy that you can look at. So I will denote it like that. It's not to confuse it with the Hamiltonian. Trying to write it differently. So if I have two measures mu and nu, say two probability measures mu and nu, I will denote the relative entropy as follows. So it will be, let's say, the expected value of log d mu d nu mu. That's if. So this is the Radon-Nikodym derivative. So it's the density of mu with respect to nu. So I want to write mu as a measurable function times nu. Okay. So if I can do that, if there is a Radon-Nikodym derivative, that is if mu is absolutely continuous with respect to nu, I define it this way, otherwise I put it equal to plus infinity. Otherwise. So that's the definition. In our case, it will be trivial that we have a density. It will be completely explicit, the density. I will just write it down. Okay? So that's the definition of relative entropy. And so maybe let me repeat. So this is the Radon-Nikodym derivative. But in our case, as I said, everything will be completely explicit of mu with respect to nu. And what the tool I need is the following inequality, which is proved in this appendix. It's Pinsker's inequality. I state it exactly in the form I need. Okay, you can state it in a bit more abstract way, but I just want to state it the way I need it. So for any measurable function f, you have that if I want to compute the expected value of f under the measure mu, and to compare it with the expected value of f under the measure nu, so I have two different measures, I want to compare the expected value of f under these two measures, then this is always smaller than, I need some subnorm of f somewhere because I need it to be homogeneous. If I multiply f by 2, it has to multiply both the left and right side of the equation, so I need something like that. And then the important part is square root of 2 times the relative entropy between mu and nu. Okay? So if you're able to show that the relative entropy is small, then you conclude that the expected values will be very close. Okay? That's exactly the kind of tools we need. Now, it's not obvious from the start that we will be able to say something about this relative entropy, but certainly it's one way to attack this problem. Okay, so if I apply this in our case, probably it's the last thing I will do today. I not have time to conclude the argument. So in our case, the two measures are this deformed measure here and the original Gibbs measure. So let's just, so in our case, let's just write so the original measure in terms of the new one. Slightly better if I do it in this way. This, say of A, this is equal to the integral over A of E minus H lambda. And now I want to put the bad, I want to put that, which is not the proper Boltzmann weight for this measure, it's the proper Boltzmann weight for the other measure. So I have to compensate. So let me continue here because it will be too long. E minus H lambda, or let's say plus H lambda T psi omega lambda eta lambda c minus h lambda nothing, omega lambda eta lambda c. Okay. And then product over I in lambda the omega. Okay. So the only thing I've divided and multiplied by the same thing, so I've just rewritten this probability. But now this, I can see it as the probability of A under the new measure times this new factor, which appears here. There is this new factor appearing, so this new factor must be the density of this measure with respect to the deformed measure. So I immediately deduce that d mu lambda eta over d mu lambda eta psi is just exponential of h lambda t psi omega lambda eta lambda c minus h lambda omega lambda eta lambda c. Okay, we just have an explicit expression for the density. So this implies that I have also an explicit expression for the relative entropy between the two measures. So it will be mu lambda eta with respect to mu lambda eta psi. So if you remember, the definition is here. So I have to take expected value with respect to the first one, which is expected value with respect to the easy one, the usual Gibbs measure. And then I have to take the log of this, but when I take the log of this, the exponential disappears, and the only thing that remains is the Hamiltonian in lambda composed with t psi minus the Hamiltonian in lambda. Okay. So I'm computing the average under the original Gibbs measure. I'm computing how much in average does the energy change when I apply this inhomogeneous rotation to the configuration. So here I just have the average energy of a configuration in the model. Here I have the average energy of a configuration after having applied this inhomogeneous rotation. So this starts looking very much like what we did in the heuristic argument. So in the heuristic argument, we were comparing the energy of the configuration with minimal energy, which was the configuration where everybody was pointing upward, with the configuration where I had rotated this pin in the middle in a suitable way, and we were comparing these two things. So we are back to something very similar. And actually, the way we are going to do that now or next week rather, is by doing the same kind of thing we did in the heuristic argument, which is Taylor expand this guy. We have to do it a bit more cleverly because some terms which were obviously zero in the heuristic argument are not obviously zero here, but you can still do it, and this will give us what we need. Okay, so next week I will explain how you use this to get a control on the relative entropy, which will give you a control on the difference between these two expectations, which will give you a control on the difference between these two expectations. Okay. Are there questions about what we are trying to do? Okay.